Hello everyone, my name is Jesus Villarreal and I'm a first year IE at Georgia Tech. Today I'm joined by my fellow hosts, Eduardo Romero and Valeria Ortega.
Hello everyone, I'm Eduardo Romero and I'm a first year mechanical engineering major here at Georgia Tech.
Hi, I'm Valeria Ortega, a first year architecture major at Georgia Tech.
Today we'll be talking about Up and Vanish Season 1.
So during this podcast we will give just a brief summary and introduction for Up and Vanished. We will review and analyze a clip from episode 3 and we'll just have some general discussion on the general topic of the podcast.
And to start off, we'll just start with some brief introduction for the podcast itself. Up and Vanished premiered on August 7th, 2016, and it investigated the case of Tara Grinstead, a beloved 30-year-old high school teacher who disappeared in Ocilla, Georgia, and was last seen on October 22nd, 2005. The podcast was created by Payne Lindsay, a filmmaker from Atlanta who had no previous podcast experience. He found Tara's case by chance one day when he was looking on the internet for unsolved cases. Payne throws himself deep into the case, talking with investigators and conducting extensive research. This podcast can be found on all listening platforms and such as Spotify, Apple, and SoundCloud.
Yeah, and what makes this podcast so interesting is it's the impact it has on the case. So the story of the crime develops in real time as new episodes of the podcast are released. This shows that if it weren't for Payne's persistence of looking at leads and evidence that had already been seen hundreds of times, the case wouldn't have progressed as it did. The podcast mainly brought the case to the attention of many people who not only wanted to see the case solved, but who also provide new leads or information to the police. So with further research, we found out the possible criminals and solutions to the crime scene.
As Eduardo stated, further investigation was needed in order to encounter a possible outcome of the extensive crime scene. Amazingly, more than a decade has passed and the crime is still unsolved. For my research, I have concluded possible solution. Firstly, Ryan killed Tara, took Bo's truck, drove to Bo's family land, and burned the body. Many people say that both Ryan and Bo are still guilty because Bo did commit the action and didn't talk to the police afterwards. Secondly, a very interesting fact I found while doing extensive research was that the body was possibly burned because Ryan didn't want to leave any evidence of him sexually assaulting the professor before committing the act of killing her. Thirdly, and apart from all of that, many people are still stating that both Ryan and Bo killed and sexually assaulted Tara. So even though different speculations have risen, criminals haven't been convicted. Their trial is set to begin in 2019, but because of COVID, everything has changed, and Ryan is in jail while Bo is out in bail. But which one is the real killer? Payne's curiosity cracked the case, but will he now be able to officially solve it?
So now we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what sparked our curiosity for wanting to investigate more of the case. Because we feel like a lot of people, just like us, when they listen to this podcast, wanted to, really be like kind of invested in the investigation and see what really happened. And so this clip that we're about to play you from episode 3 really sparked our curiosity and got us more invested in this case and, in what really happened. So now we'll take a listen.
There were 2 major pieces of evidence that investigators found at Tara's home. The first, and perhaps the biggest one, was a single latex glove found in Tara's yard. Here's Maurice Godwin on the glove.
It was in front of the steps, and it was laying there at the edge of the grass and some pine straw. They collected it, and they did analysis on it. They found full profile of white male DNA on the glove. And it's been entered into the Georgia DNA database, and it's been entered into CODIS for like 10 years, and there's never been a match.
How many people did they swab in this case?
Upwards of 200 students, any males and stuff that knew her. In Georgia, you have to be convicted of a felony to be swabbed.
So in Georgia, you have to willingly give up a DNA swab. They can't make you do it.
They walk up to you, they ask you for it. If you volunteer it, fine. If you don't, then they have to have enough probable cause to write a warrant and go back with it and get the swab. My question about the glove is this. If you abduct somebody and you're struggling with that individual, why is the glove even off of the hand to be able to even fall to the ground?
Right, so you're saying if you're going to wear latex gloves to commit a crime, why are they off your hands before you leave the scene?
I think it's a 50-50 chance that the glove was a plant.
The second.
So what the person talking in the phone in that clip was actually one of the lead investigators of the case back when it first started. And what this clip basically says is that one of the big pieces of evidence left in the crime scene was that glove, and how it left DNA evidence that they then used and swabbed 200 people and found no matches. And what interested me at least was what he said at the end, which was, why was that glove on the ground? Like, I've been in many lab activities, and like those latex gloves are really hard to take off of your hand. So like, I find it really weird, and I agree with what he says, where it's pretty likely that they actually left it there on purpose. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely really weird. I mean, it's exactly how you said. Like, why, if you committed this crime while wearing this glove, why would you ever leave it at the crime scene? It really doesn't make any sense, and it's just really confusing. But I mean, that's kind of what all these episodes that we've been listening to have kind of covered. Is, you know, there's kind of a reason that the case, you know, wasn't investigated for about 10 years. It was just because there was a lot of inconsistent pieces of evidence, and they didn't really make sense, and a lot of, you know, just like things that, you know, evidence that wasn't really, you know, conclusive. And so that's what this podcast kind of goes over, is that evidence. And Payne Lindsay, I mean, he's kind of in our shoes, where he's really just trying to find out exactly what happened. And I think that's, you know, one of the coolest parts about the podcast is the fact that it brought more attention to the case, and it caused it to actually kind of revamp the investigation and really keep it going in a way that didn't before. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on it?
As Jesus and Eduardo have stated, the glove is very significant in this investigation. If a criminal doesn't want to leave any traces, as he clearly tried to do because he burned the body, then he would definitely remember to pick up the glove. Apart from that, decades later, and further investigation, the GBI have found a direct match with the fingerprints of the gloves and Ryan's fingerprints. Based on this evidence, he clearly killed her, but the reasoning behind it is still unknown. Was he really robbing the purse and committed the crime because he was afraid she was going to testify afterwards, or was there a reasoning behind this story?
So yeah, I think that's like the wonderful part about this podcast, is that the crime itself had been left to rot before, and the podcast revived the crime in a way that not only the police but also people watching the podcast could contribute and say, I think it's this and I think it's that. And I think that's something that was really out of the scope of what this person wanted to reach with the podcast. He was just interested in this idea and wanted to share it with people. And yeah, and that leads me to the ethics. I think that with the ethics of the podcast, he did a really good job with it, because he didn't cross any boundaries. He always talked to people who wanted to talk with him, and he never abused any of the privacy of nobody else. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think he crossed any lines, and from what we listened to, I really don't think there's anything that shows that he really, like you said, did anything unethical.
I personally think the same. And what he was trying to obtain from this podcast was principally to understand the crime that was so significant during this time period, and how the families of the victim did want an answer, and he tried to talk with the victims to understand their reasoning and their thoughts behind the crime.
Yeah, for sure. And I think besides doing well with the ethics, I think the podcast was just really well made in general. You know, talk about kind of the narrative elements he used. He almost made it seem like a novel, or even just like a documentary, because it was very almost like cinematic, even though, it was just audio. It was very much made like a thriller. He kept us in suspense. along the way, like when discovering new pieces of evidence, you were there every step of the way, and I thought it was super well done.
It
What do you
was.
guys?
All of the episodes actually ended in a cliffhanger. Like the final part, you would have to click the next episode to learn what happened. He would give a critical piece of evidence or information at the end of each episode to keep you hooked with the podcast. And I also think that there was like a different type of podcast because like I'm normally used to a round table like this one where people are talking with each other about a topic. This was more like a documentary type. Documentary with no images. It was just like stitched together different calls, and there was music, there was background music that made it
that
really
was
intense. So this was like a different type of podcast, but I really liked the production and the narrative behind it. I thought it was really, really solid.
Yeah, I agree with you, Eduardo, because it did leave you in cliffhanger, but it kept the audience like hooked. Like you wanted to. It was not boring at all. Like you wanted to keep investigating and reading and researching about the crime, and it did it in a way that like everything flowed together, and every like episode has its own continuation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think next we're going to move on to the analysis. What does this podcast mean for true crime podcasting? I honestly think this podcast is really similar to Serial. Like I felt like had like a similar kind of feeling, and the way it was made, it was very, it was really good, for storytelling, but it was also like good for the facts. And so I think that this fits in perfectly with the genre of true crime podcasting as a whole, and it was just another great, case that was kind of brought to life through true crime podcasting.
I think that it shared some aspects with Serial, but also it had some different ones, like what we talked before. Like the production was a lot different. The Serial was more, like I said before, the round table type thing.
Yeah.
But it also shared many aspects. Like, for example, there was one episode where the podcast, where Payne went in his car and actually took the road that Tara took. And this was something that was directly linked to something in an episode of Serial where they actually went in the car and tried to recreate what happened in the crime. So I thought that was a funny link between both of those.
Yeah, they do relate. Apart from like getting to know each character and like their story and this crime that they both related to Up and Vanish and Serial, as Eduardo stated, they did like know and understood what happened subsequently in the acts to follow the crime scene. So that was like interlocking both the podcasts.
Yeah, and I think overall we all really enjoyed the podcast as a whole, and we definitely recommend it for anyone who's interested in true crime or podcasting in general.